Hello, hello.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to another Helixiora office hours. Next to me, we
Okay.
have Datalina right here. This is me. That's Lena. No, that's Lena. There we go. So, what's
So,
our topic for today, Lena? What are we talking
yeah,
about?
today we're going to talk about the most boring topic for technical people company goals and how to make them data driven. The idea came because there's actually pretty interesting statistics about what percentage of organizations are failing to meet their goals. And I think this is also why technical people don't like the topic of company goals, because this has turned into this concept of how to not give people their annual bonuses,
Mhm.
because you can always be like, well, the company didn't meet its goals this year, and this is why you're not getting the bonus that you thought you would get.
Yeah, I've definitely been in that situation. Um, but let's set aside the politics of this aspect, and talk about what good it can do. Let's start at the beginning. Let's take our audience through, okay, why is it a good idea? And if you're going to do it, how do you do it?
Okay. So first, strategy, and
Ooh,
then
I know
execution.
that one. Strategy, that's the easy part. I know that part.
How easy is it?
Well, strategy is easy. You just put down a bunch of words on paper and then you're ready to go. I
Yeah,
don't know.
talk about talking, think
Exactly.
about thinking, and it's strategy.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think most organizations they have a strategy and goals that are oriented towards revenue, because companies exist to make money, even if they also talk about other things like culture, like community, and giving back to society, and mission and vision and purpose. And at the end of the day, if you're not meeting your revenue targets, then something's wrong.
Yeah.
Now, how many companies do you think are effectively using data when they're shaping their strategy?
I think that's a trick question.
Of course it is. I wouldn't ask it if
So,
it was an easy one.
maybe the percentage of people or organizations using data is fairly high, but maybe the majority of those are using the wrong data or using data wrong to make those
Mm.
decisions. What do you think?
I agree, because the way, from my perspective, from what I've seen on strategy meetings when we're aligned on what we want to achieve as a company, we've looked at the revenue for the past year, and we've set based on that targets for next year's revenue, and then we would have revenue targets based on different services or products that the company is selling. I do think that sometimes it's a wishful target. So, for example, I would really like to have the predictable revenue of a service that is paid every month. I don't think that I've seen companies use the data on like here's how cost efficient this service is to sell and to deliver. This is what we get the most value of. And then this turning into not just a strategy, increase the revenue of this service to this much, but try and target more customers of this type, or let's work on reworking the service definition or the product so that it fits a little bit better to achieve that.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing I see happen a lot is that in the strategy phase, data and specifically key performance indicators are used to give direction, to steer the ship in a certain strategy direction in a certain mode of execution. But then 6 months down the line, the data is no longer about giving direction, but they've become cold hard facts, and everyone starts to game the system, work around a problem in order to meet the KPIs, in order to meet their goals. And I think that's a big issue that I see a lot of companies struggle with because that's how the mind works. Apparently, that's how we humans do things, and so there's always that danger of falling into that trap. And I remember us talking about the pitfalls of KPIs and the, having toxic KPIs in the past a
Mhm.
couple times. Uh, what are some of those KPIs that are just avoidable? You should stay away from that are toxic.
So, me having worked a lot in technical support, any KPI in technical support can become toxic very quickly. Whether it's how many responses to customers are you sending, if that becomes a KPI, people love a scoreboard, love competing. Like you can let people play basketball and they'll play like a game and just have fun. And the minute you start keeping score, it turns into a very different game. So I've seen also things like how many tickets are you closing? People can start closing tickets just to meet the KPI, or like average ticket close time. I've also seen like when we wanted to encourage people to not just spend their time on incident work and alarms in DevOps, but do more change management. And we soon discovered that they would track a lot of time on changes, but it was like 2 3 changes for the entire month.
Yeah.
So you slowly adapt to how people are tricking the system of keeping score. And then you develop something else like, okay, here's your average time per change that you're spending.
Mm-hmm.
So I think KPIs are a very, very difficult field because it's also very touchy. People are always going into defensive when you start talking about performance. And the other thing about KPIs is that they generally fail um, to measure non-operational
Mm-hmm.
stuff that is not part of the business as usual. So, for example, you can have someone who is maybe average or even below average on most of the business as usual stuff, but every 3 months they come up with this great idea that brings up a lot of improvements into the team, cost efficiencies even. Like, how do you measure that? How do you measure good ideas?
Yeah. Yeah, and again, I think that's where a pitfall definitely lies for a lot of organization is to focus just on those numbers and then forget that numbers are a way to measure the thing that you're actually doing. And that the thing you're actually doing is actually the goal that you're trying to achieve. And again, data is part of it, KPIs are part of it. They are a great tool to measure progress, but there's A, different ways of measuring progress, and B, that KPIs need to be um, a part of achieving that goal and not the goal itself. And I've seen this happen in a couple companies, especially when bonuses are attached to it, like we discussed already.
Yeah.
Um, but having a steerless ship where you're not able to measure progress is also not good, right? So
Yeah.
this discussion is more about how to choose the right ones and how to ensure that once you've chosen a set of KPIs, you can continue using them what they're for, i.e., measuring progress, and prevent that they become a goal in and of themselves. So
Mhm.
I remember us talking about a book, The Four Principles of Execution.
Disciplines.
Disciplines.
4 disciplines of executions. Yeah, of execution. That was what I wanted to talk about as well, because it's a different read on the usual goals and KPIs topic. Because they compare it to like you having a goal to lose weight,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have a lag measure, they call it, which is something that you measure, and by the time you measure it, it's already happened. So you're looking at your rear view mirror and you can see, okay, this is how many kilos I weigh now. And they also talk about lead measure, so the things that you're doing in order to lose weight.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a little bit different from KPIs, because KPIs have come to be associated with how well you're doing the business as usual stuff. And goals are about doing something on top of business as usual, or doing something that makes your business as usual slightly different. So in the example of losing weight, your lead measures would be how many steps a day am I doing, and how many calories a day am I doing, how much water am I drinking, how many times do I go to the gym or
Mm.
running or whatever.
Yeah. And then the kilograms are
The lag measure.
the lag measures, exactly.
And these are just a couple of concepts from the book. The book says one of the things that companies habitually get wrong is that they have too many goals.
Yeah.
And we see that all the time. You don't just have a goal about revenue, you also have other goals associated with it. Because if you just have the goal about revenue, then people are like, oh, but what about us? Wasn't this a people first company 2 minutes ago? So you're like, yeah, we need to also have a goal about people. But those are things that are lead measures to
Mm.
your lag measure. So you're basically you're saying, in order for me to achieve this revenue, I also need to ensure that I don't have high attrition, people are happy and productive and engaged, that I invest enough time and effort in bringing new customers, that my current customers are renewing and happy and maybe even promoting me to their friends and coworkers and whatever. Um, so rule principle number one is pick one wildly important goal. And this is what I love most about it is the book says, think of your goals as airplanes and you're the air traffic control. You can't land all four of the airplanes currently circling in the air at the same time. You have to pick one, land it, then the
Mm.
next one, and the one after, and so on. So pick one wildly important goal. The second one is to focus on your like define your lag and lead measures. The third one is to create this compelling scoreboard,
Mm-hmm.
because I think one of the reasons people don't engage with this with their company goals is that, like, we know we have to do this much revenue, but how does this relate to my business as usual? It's so
Yeah.
difficult to cascade a company goal into an individual contributor level.
Yeah.
And then the fourth discipline, which is possibly the most important one, is to create a cadence of accountability
Mm-hmm.
where people commit to doing stuff that is going to move the lead measures and the lag measures. So, for example, if you're saying, I want to have uh, more revenue on this service, you can have people be like, okay, one lead measure would be finding upsell opportunities for the existing customers. Then how many meetings we had with existing customers where we discuss these upsell opportunities,
Mm-hmm.
how many deals we closed, and so on and so on.
Yeah. So one thing that kind of triggered me when we were talking about this, and you mentioned it just now again, is, well, two things. So let's start with the first one: is have a compelling scoreboard. What does that mean?
So, for example, if in the example that I just gave about generating more revenue out of the existing customers, if we decide that the strategies for that are these creating upsell opportunities and so on, then you need to measure if you're doing what you said you'd be doing on these. So you have a dashboard where you have this is how much how many upsell opportunities we have identified. This is how many people are currently investing time in this. This is
Mm-hmm.
how many meetings we've had, and this is all visualized. And then next comes the cadence of accountability, where every week people meet and they're like, okay, last week I spoke to this person, I created this document, I did this. Next week I'm going to do that. And this is the really interesting finding for me in the book, that people are afraid of exposing themselves as like not competent or not delivering to their manager,
Mm-hmm.
but even more so to their coworkers. So actually, team accountability has a higher weight than accountability to your direct manager.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the
Okay.
scoreboard is not like the tickets closed and things like that, but it's about uh, what I said I would do, how much
Mhm.
of this was done.
Yeah. Yeah, and that brings up a notoriously difficult thing that I've also fallen victim to myself is over communication of what you're trying to achieve. Because, so we touched on this a little before, where it's so hard for the entire company in their day to day work to keep thinking about, okay, I've got this goal, I've got that objective, I need to reach that goal by, next quarter. To translate those high level, super vague things into something that is important for them to do, this week, today. And so that translation from these are the big ticket items to this is what I'm doing today, that is just notoriously difficult. And it becomes more difficult if you don't over communicate those high level goals, those company goals that you're trying to achieve. And so one of the things I've fallen victim to, and I try to be better about, is to over communicate. Hey, but does this fit into your company objective that you're a part of? Does these are the company objectives? This is what we're trying to reach, and continue to communicate those goals, not
Hmm.
just once, not just 5 times, but every day for the entire quarter.
I found
Because that's the only way you're going to get any traction with those goals. And a scoreboard will definitely help, of course, because that's also a way of communicating.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think one of the greatest challenges, especially when you have like a technical team and a big one, maybe, because I used to run a managed services team, and for managed services, it's important to like the KPIs for the team itself are how cost efficient are we? So how many engineers to how many customers do we need? And can we onboard more customers without proportionally increasing the number of engineers? And then we also have customer related KPIs like how quick are we to resolve incidents? How quick are we to understand and implement changes? Um, and one thing that we identified as something that relates to all of the KPIs
Mm-hmm.
was we wanted to reduce monitoring noise,
Yeah.
because monitoring noise is an interruption. So it makes everyone working with monitoring less efficient. It also creates the boy who cried wolf situation, where if you get too many alerts, you start disbelieving the criticality of every other alert because, oh my God, they just keep on coming and it's never really that important until it is. So we decided to focus on that, and that is very tangible, and that's something that people can easily understand. Technical people who work with us day to day, it still
Mm-hmm.
relates to the company goal, but we're no longer talking about the company goal. They don't have to talk about it. And then the scoreboard we created was we measured how much time people were spending on the goal versus the team average, because when you start measuring things like that, like personal contribution, personal performance, if you're anything like me, you check GDPR and you will understand that you can't show another person's performance to other people. You have to obfuscate the personal performance data. So what we did was we compared personal performance to team average.
Mm-hmm.
So you could see, okay, I've logged this much time against the team objective as opposed to the average for the team. But we were also tracking every lead measure that we had identified. So, for example, let's change the structure of this alarm from this to that, and then we would measure. Here are three customers that are still using the old method of monitoring. Here are three customers that are using the new method, and we could tell if this lead measure was actually contributing to what we thought it would contribute to. And then we had the problem of how, like, the cadence of accountability meeting, people would always go into unnecessary detail and
Yeah.
over focus on like, but why do you implement this that way? Why don't you do it this way? And other stuff. So like other people on the meeting would doze off. But at the end of the day, in a matter of 3 to 6 months, in 3 months we saw an improvement. In 6 months we achieved the objective to reduce monitoring noise by 30%.
Yeah.
And at the same time, the number of customers increased by 20%.
Yeah.
So when you take that into account, it was a huge accomplishment. And because it's like a game, people were engaged, and it contributed to customers feeling like the service was improving, and management feeling like we are becoming more efficient as a team. At the same time, and this is a very big risk with anything that's a goal that is out a little bit outside of the business as usual, we had a couple of customers who said it feels like you are prioritizing internal initiatives over a change that I created.
Yeah.
Because we're obviously every change that we make to their infrastructure was visible to them, so they knew we were doing stuff around monitoring. So I think that's something that I would address next time I'm doing an exercise like that.
And how would you address
Good question.
it? See, because that brings up an interesting, so two interesting aspects. Um, and I'm gonna oversimplify just a little bit, but you can only measure the things that you know and the things that you know how to measure, i.e., KPIs and OKRs. Kathleen, I saw your comment. We'll address that in a bit. They're really aimed at measuring progress towards something that you roughly know the starting point, the end goal, and then how to get there, right? So, one, KPIs you can only really use if you've thought of the path and the goal enough to make the progress measurable in that very concrete sense. So, that leans into operational work, day to day tasks, a little more than creative work, where Lena and I also spent time on this difference between creative and being data driven in the previous office hours. Go check that out. But there's a risk of over focusing on the things that you can measure and the things that you know. Um, and that leads me into the OKR part, where I don't think humans are necessarily very compatible with being very data driven, because they don't like to be measured. They don't like to be so close to showing whether something is working out or not. People are generally pretty risk averse, and especially if you start to measure them on a very frequent basis. So it plus, and this is the other angle that I'm forgetting, but I should touch on. A lot of companies do not want to show all of their cards, and so a lot of times OKRs and KPIs are just a little vague or a little off to the side from the goal that you're actually trying to achieve. So, for instance, I know that if you're trying to get investment or you're trying to go public on the stock exchange, there's a bunch of things that you just cannot say. Sometimes even not allowed to say. And so that means you have company goals, and then you have company goals that are actually part of the OKRs and the KPIs. And so that's misleading. And especially combined with people being risk averse, they will not share their best ideas anymore. Um,
Hmm.
so it's a little bit of a cynical take on using KPIs, but it's a risk to be aware of. That yeah.
We've had in that managed services team, we created personal KPI dashboards.
Mm-hmm.
where people could see their own dashboard, and of course they couldn't see anyone else's, but of course people would also get together and show each other their personal dashboards. They could see
Wow.
themselves against the team average. As I said, they cheated, they used the
Mm-hmm.
information uh, to cheat, but they also started becoming interested in it. They started asking questions about the data.
Mm-hmm.
They even started asking for, okay, don't just give me that like last month stuff. I want to see a trend.
Mm-hmm.
So we definitely saw the development of an interest in the data. And I want to also add something about something else that you said, that you can only measure so much. When we started this monitoring exercise, we didn't have information about which alarm was actionable and which one was
Mm-hmm.
complete nonsense.
Yeah.
And people started logging that as they closed the alarms. Not super accurately, of course, because they were never really sure which which one was it. Like, yeah, maybe there was a temporary problem, but that does that make it actionable or non-actionable? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, like, it feels good to know that like you can mobilize the entire team with just the purpose of being able to see the data.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to say that even today, like this is, I don't know, like probably 3 years after we started this exercise, um, no decision is made in that team without creating dashboards and analyzing the data first. And not just in the leadership team, like people, the engineers are asking to see data if something's changing. How do you know?
Yeah.
So I think it can happen, but it's a slow transition. And I also think that people don't truly engage in the team's data until they
Mm-hmm.
see themselves in it. So while they
That is
don't
true.
want to be
Yeah.
measured on performance, you don't get their interest until you
Mm-hmm.
show them their own personal data. Like, this is your mirror, have a look.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder how that plays into different personality types. That's a topic for another time, maybe. So I wonder. So one of the things that I have struggled with in the past, and I've seen others struggle with too, is how do you set those? How do you come up with a good set of KPIs to measure the execution of your strategy? Because we jokingly said at the beginning, strategy is easy. You write down a bunch of shit and then you go do it. But I think execution is super hard, plus measuring where you are in your journey of that execution is even harder.
I think the one of the problems is that the first measures that come to your mind come from your mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my lesson from that time when our team's goals ended up interfering negatively with customer goals was that we didn't collect enough feedback on how customers were measuring us.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that in order to have a good measuring system that works, you have to collect as many viewpoints as possible.
Yeah.
So
And
if
then
you're
you
management.
distill
Mhm.
you then distill those down to their core. How does that work?
Well, for example, if you're tracking the performance of an operations team,
Mm-hmm.
how many incidents do we have? How many problem records get logged? How many changes do we execute? How many changes are reverted? The more you can automate the measurement of these, the less you rely on people to fill this in, the better. Uh, and when you present the first version of the dashboard, it's very important to start the conversation with the engineers, with the people,
Mm-hmm.
and get their view on this, because they'll tell you something like, "Yeah, you're measuring this, but actually, what's happening is this and that and the other."
Yeah.
So, if you really want to have this measure go up, then you need to be measuring the other three measures because they're all interdependent.
Yeah.
And when you do this exercise with customers as well, you have a broader perspective on how everything connects to everything else.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to relate this to my own experience. And indeed, the correct measurements or the correct measures to figure out your progress are really down to not just thinking of a single metric and then start to implement that, but dive into the nuances of that, dive into the consequences of measuring that specific thing without a certain piece of context, or maybe without measuring a different thing and then correlating the two. Like, there's so much nuance to be reached before it's actually valuable,
Hmm.
that you need to go through that exercise if you really want to have that measurable KPI. In a lot of cases, and that's a route I usually took with new teams that had new objectives that started out, and specifically are in that creative phase of we don't know what we don't know, is to give them only the high level, very long term vision. This is where I want you to go, and then just figure out next steps, and only that.
Hmm.
So that also works. And the point I'm trying to bring up is, in certain cases, the act of measuring, because it takes time, it takes effort, it's something that you need to configure. You need to have a dashboard. You need to dive into all of those nuances. Sometimes it's not worth it, right? Sometimes it's okay to just have the goal. But in a
Hmm.
lot of cases, especially for operational teams that are longer lived, that work towards a longer term goal, it does make sense. Um, but in a lot of cases, dive into those nuances, dive into that context before you start actually measuring it.
Yeah, it's actually a very scientific process, or it has to be a very scientific process of execution, where you know that you need to move the needle on this thing, whether it's
Yep.
revenue or something else, and then you build hypothesis on what would work in that direction. So measuring correlation is very important. And mm, in the Four Disciplines of Execution book, there was one story that has stuck with me, and I keep telling it to people every couple of years or months,
Mm-hmm.
about a shoe store chain that wanted to, they set their wildly important goal on increasing the number of customers that left the store having purchased shoes,
Mm-hmm.
because that was something like 10 or 20%.
Yeah.
And they were like, we have to have more customers like entering and then leaving with a pair of shoes.
Mm-hmm.
And because they were a chain, they could experiment with different hypotheses. So one store tried a different script on how to speak to customers, and they would mark how many people were trained on the new script. They would mark conversations based on the new script. So this was their scoreboard.
Mm-hmm.
And a different store from the same chain would try positioning shoes in a different way. Another store tried a new method of doing discounts,
Mm-hmm.
and so on and so on. Like, obviously, this is in the United States, so multiple chain, like multiple shoe stores could be involved. And the winning strategy was hilarious, because it was measuring children's feet.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it turned out that buying shoes for your children is notoriously difficult, because you don't know exactly what size is going to fit them, because they grow all the time. And because they grow all the time, you buy them shoes, and then 2 months later,
They
what do
got
you
new
know?
ones. Yeah.
You got to buy new ones. So this store started measuring children's feet, resulting in like the perfect fit for the child.
Mm-hmm.
That would result in the parent buying children all of their children's shoes, and then
Yeah.
returning the next season to buy more shoes. And then they put this strategy in place in the entire store chain.
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, data driven is about being more scientific, and this is why, like, the way it works in business is, I think, the carrot and the stick. It's like, here are your KPIs. If you meet your KPIs, you're going to get a bonus. If you don't meet your KPIs, you're not going to be promoted. We're going to put you on a personal improvement plan and then let you go. And it's
Yeah.
not about, look, us as a company, we want to achieve this. For your department or team, this means achieving this.
Yeah.
Let's see what works. Let's see what doesn't. And let's try to gamify it and see if we can get there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But have you actually been in a company where that happened?
No. So I've only ever seen it work in ways where people worked around them. So, for instance, a thing that I come across is instead of KPIs and goals being outcome based, i.e., they talk about a certain value that you create by doing the thing. They talk about the output of a certain amount of work. So, for instance, I don't know what's a good example. As a company, we will put out 100 blog posts is very output driven. The outcome version of that would be we want to increase our conversion of customers based on our content marketing strategy, blah blah blah. And so what I see happen a lot is that these KPIs are very much output based. We'll do the 100 blog posts without thinking too much about the value or measuring the value that's being created along the way. So that's an example of how you circumvent using OKRs and KPIs. Um, that My point is, I've rarely seen a pure play KPI for being used in the way they're supposed to be used, meaning to advance the company goal specifically and concretely. I've only ever seen them being misused.
Hmm. Yeah, I have the same experience with, of course, the exception of where I read the book and I came to work one day and I told the team I read the book and now we're doing this.
Yeah.
It was super exciting. And then the leadership team was like, "Yeah, a little bit of heads up would have been nice because like you didn't even tell us that you've decided to change the way we do goals and KPIs and all of that."
Yeah.
It's sort of worked out in the end. But I remember I was part of a large corporation, I think some 10 years or more ago,
Mm.
and I was there for 4 years. And every year my manager would come and tell me, so, time for you to set your goals.
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, oh, me? I set my goals. Okay, I'm gonna read this book and I
Yeah.
want to attend this conference and I want to do this. And like, no, it has to come from the top a little bit.
Yeah.
But then you have to give people the freedom to experiment. So, for example, if you have a goal to attract more customers, don't just be like, we have to create this many blog posts. No, be like,
Mm.
let's experiment. We're going to do this. Who wants to write blog post? Okay, you three.
Mm.
Then we want to also do like a podcast. Who wants to do a podcast? Okay, you two. Who wants to go and speak at events? Okay, go and do that. And then you try and measure which one worked. But then in marketing, that's notoriously difficult, isn't it?
Yep. It is. It is because it's so the output of your process is so disconnected from the outcome of and the value that if you don't have a strong feedback loop, and in marketing often you don't have a very short strong feedback loop, it's nearly impossible to attach a piece of output, a blog post, to an outcome, a new customer. And and again, that makes it super hard and open to interpretation and people kind of gaming the system and focusing on output instead of outcome. So a lot of this is also about, and this kind of goes back to the original topic of today's office hours, is how do you help companies set those company goals in a way that's realistic, attainable? Doesn't it open up to a huge amount of fraud with the KPIs? And I think that's often overlooked is the ability to actually measure the impact that you're making or the progress that you're making based on a feedback loop, and actually building those feedback loops so that and in a lot of cases it's easy, right? The monitoring example that you talked about, that's fairly easy because monitoring is a feedback loop in and of itself. But for a lot of business outcomes, that feedback loop is just not there. Don't
Mm.
say I'm not saying we should measure everything, because that's simply impossible. There's a cost benefit to it. But I think that's often overlooked is A, focus on outcomes, B, find a way to measure the outcome and relating it to the work, the output that's being done. Um, and sometimes that's even more important than the goal itself because, again, working on making something measurable is sometimes just more useful.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is why it's important to create an open culture where
Mm-hmm.
people do think of this as not something that's used to penalize them, but something that is an experiment in and of itself. And the only thing that you really need to measure is um, what you're doing around testing the hypothesis that you set forward.
Yep.
Because you don't know necessarily which hypothesis is going to work or not. And if acquiring new business is difficult to track down to exactly what you did to make that happen, then let's talk about the other super difficult measure of net promoter score.
Yeah. I think I've given you my opinion on NPS before. And I've talked about this in this office hours too. Nuance and context are so wildly important that there's almost no single metric, no single value that you can use without any context and without any nuance. There's always context, there's always nuance. But again, if you're just measuring customer satisfaction and you ask them, would you recommend this? And they blindly say, yeah, sure. Then you're opening yourself up for numbers that don't mean anything. Yes, you have a KPI. Does it actually mean anything? No, it doesn't. And
So
NPS, I think, is a beautiful example of that. But go ahead.
yeah, psychology became a science when it started doing experiments and collecting and analyzing data. It's actually
Yeah.
statistics was applied, factor analysis was created by the first psychologists when they were studying intelligence and trying to figure out if it was one intelligence or multiple intelligences. But anyway, I
Yeah.
digress. So in experiments, you have two qualifications of your test, of your
Mm-hmm.
survey, and those are reliability and
Yeah. R
validity.
value. Yeah.
And validity is, am I measuring what I think I'm measuring? And reliability is, if I give this person the same test
Mm-hmm.
2 days or 2 weeks or 2 months later, am I still going to get the same result?
Yeah.
Or is this going to be influenced by the way the person is feeling at the moment?
Yeah.
And I think with NPS, both validity and reliability are not very high.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily because of the questions. I think it's just like you try and measure it quarterly or maybe twice a year,
Mm-hmm.
so that you can grab an entire data period and compare it to another data period. But you can always catch the person at a very good or a very bad time, and the result is not going to be representative of the entire quarter or period that you're measuring. I've had
Yeah. Yeah.
I've seen that multiple times, and then there's the point of correlation. There are studies that show that NPS does not actually correlate to increased customer retention. Sometimes customers will give you a good score, and then several months down the line, they leave.
Yeah. Yeah, because again, you're not capturing all of the nuance. Plus, maybe they don't actually want to tell you or give an indication that they are considering leaving, so they give you a high NPS score and then they leave because they don't care.
Mm,
Nuance, context, data doesn't mean anything. I think that is one of my main conclusions in everything data. Data is super useful, but make sure you have enough of the nuance and capture enough of the context and use it as a tool in your tool belt and definitely not the only one
mm.
because the world, reality is messy, the world is complex. Expressing complex things in simple terms almost never works out. Be mindful
Yeah,
of
and
that.
this is why, for example, every time we had a lower than normal NPS score, a lower than what we wanted, we would have a customer success manager discuss that with the customer and also an account manager. So we would have two different
Yeah.
people in separate conversations trying to extract a little more information from the customer. And I think we are moving in a direction where some of the data could be collected and analyzed automatically. We're not there yet because I've seen what AI does with like engagement surveys and assigning sentiment. It's not great.
No.
It will be at some point. At the moment it isn't, and still it doesn't
Again,
mean that you have to stop using or trying.
no, but it is important to realize that if you put garbage in, you're going to get garbage out. And so if you don't put in the full truth um, in whatever data set that sentiment analysis is doing, you're not getting the full picture. You can analyze an incomplete picture, but you know that the result is going to be,
Yeah,
yeah.
pretty much.
All right.
And yeah, I think data, well, data can help go execution a lot. I also think that it's a big portion of it is a cultural shift because we've we're still transitioning into a world where we're not thinking as people, as like employees, like we tell them what to do and they have to do it, and we measure that they need to do it, and then we give them feedback like, you're not doing what I thought you'd be doing and I'm paying you, so you better start doing it. Into a world where we're seeing more of a partnership.
Yeah.
And I think the shift to more flexible working hours is a shift in that direction. So I think in the next few decades we're going to see the nature of work changing a lot, and it will be important to engage people when in this more experimentative approach
Yeah.
to goal execution.
Yeah. And sometimes you need, again, you need a toolbox full of tools, right? So, for, like I said, for new teams, I like to experiment with just a long term vision. This is what I want. I don't know how to get there. You figure it out. Figure out what your next step is. That's also a form of a KPI. It's just suitable for a very specific situation where there's lots of experimentation. For teams that are in a more steady state, you can have more KPIs, drill down to the nuances of it, ask all of the teams that are involved for their opinion, for their feedback, so that you're measuring the right thing in the right way for the right people, etc. Again, the answer is not you should do KPIs or you shouldn't do KPIs. The question is, do you have enough experience in doing it right so that you can choose the method suitable for what you're trying to solve for? And I hate being the architect that always says it depends, but I am that person that says you have a toolbox full of tools, pick the right one, use the right one, but actually use it in the right way too.
Yeah, and I'd also say, if it doesn't work, put it back in the box.
Oh yes,
Try something else. Think
yep.
of this as experimentation. But yeah, uh,
Everything is experimentation. I like that.
just to summarize, you have to take people in mind. Whenever you're doing the go execution, you need to take their perspective on things, because otherwise you're risking being at the top of the iceberg and not seeing a huge portion of it underwater.
Yep.
And also, people are not going to see it as their goals unless they are involved in shaping them. Then correlation super important. You have to be able to measure um, all of the bits and pieces that can influence one another so that you can understand if one internal initiative that you're doing is actually adversely affecting external customers,
Yep.
or that this one little thing you did has a good effect on that measure, but it's sort of having a bad effect on a different measure.
Yep.
And doing all of this correlation and explanatory analysis into figuring out how does this organization actually work and which hypothesis has the best outcome.
Exactly. Nice. So how about we wrap up for today?
Yeah. Anything you
Perfect.
want to add on top of the summary?
No, I guess I said my part. I echo what you said. Take the people into account. Use it as a tool in your toolbox. Don't use it as the single only thing. Use it in a nuanced way. Look at statistical methods to make your OKRs better. Don't trust the numbers unless you've given it a lot of thought.
Yeah.
Yep.
And
All
if
right.
you're still struggling, you can always get in touch with us and we'll help you in the goal strategy phase and in the goal execution phase and in the phase of actually getting that data visualized, measured, correlated, and presented to the people in a way that it works as a motivating scoreboard and not as something that they dread and disbelieve.
That is a great bombshell to end on. So, for everyone watching, thank you so much for being with us for another almost full hour. We'll be back soon. We don't have a specific date yet for the next one, but somewhere in the next couple of weeks, we'll be back. One of the topics that we do want to tackle is um, the area of team topology. So this is a book that I've read a while ago. I'm wildly interested in it, and we're gonna have one of our more engineering folks, Colin Charles, to join us on stage and ask me all kinds of questions on the book, so that we can figure all of this out together and have a little fun along the way. So hopefully that'll be in your LinkedIn notifications in a couple of weeks. Keep a lookout for those, and until then, see you next time.
See ya. Bye, everyone.